Welcome to Mythbusters Reading Edition. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education.
And I'm Lynn Givens from Connect to Comprehension.
Comprehension myth. If a student can read, he can comprehend. And I think this is definitely something that needs to be addressed, because just because you can read does not mean that you comprehend. And I think it's something that people take for granted, especially if reading and comprehending reading came easily to them. Because as it is for learning to read, learning how to understand what you're reading needs to be taught to many students, and knowing where to take the information out of the text, and especially to dig that deeper layer, right? And know that there can be meaning taken away from actually critically thinking about what's being said in the text.
I actually had a reading teacher tell me that, give me that statement in a school in Florida. And it was all I could do to just not scream. I just smiled politely and walked away, especially when this was a training that I had done on comprehension strategies. And she obviously probably didn't want to listen to any of it because she was under the misunderstanding of this myth. I think what you said is absolutely right, that comprehension needs to be an active process. And we need to, I think the missing piece in this myth is that students need to not only read, but think about what they are reading, that whole metacognitive aspect of reading. So while I'm reading, I'm asking myself questions, I'm making pictures, I'm deciding if something makes sense or it doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, I'll go back and reread it or ask somebody about it, or all of those metacognitive strategies, those strategies that are thinking about my own reading, thinking about my own thinking, need to go on. And just because a student is reading, just like you have a student read a passage and you're timing him and you ask him what he's read and he says, I don't know. Well, that student didn't comprehend. So we can't assume that just because a student is a fluent reader, that he's a good comprehender, because there's a whole, like you said, a whole other set of layers that come in addition to being able to read, even if you are reading fluently, even if it sounds like, I've had many kids fool me. They sound like they're reading fluently. They're reading, yeah, they're reading in some meaningful phrases and they're using pretty good intonation, but they can't answer more than questions about maybe, tell me what you read. They can maybe do that. Is that all there is to comprehension? Absolutely not. Comprehension is not just recall. That's the very simplest layer of comprehension. So just because a student can recall doesn't mean that he's really comprehending. It just means that he's recalling.
They need to be taught how to bring in their background knowledge into the situation. And the great thing about this is it's something that can be done a lot through modeling, right? And it's something that we teach parents to do when they're reading books to their kids as young children. Oh, you know what? I really like this because it reminds me of this. Or, oh, how do you think they feel about that situation? And when you're reading novels out loud to your class, I mean, kids love that, having their teacher read to them. I don't care what grade you are. It's always nicer to have your teacher read it to you and hear their expression, and then teach them how to take that knowledge, whether it's a novel, whether it's nonfiction, learning about the science. I think it's really important that we take that time to explicitly teach children how to read the different types of text, because the way that you approach reading a novel is different than you'd approach reading an academic text, whether it's in social studies, in history, in sciences, right?
Yes, absolutely. I love what you said about modeling, because that is really a wonderfully effective way to teach kids how to do the kind of thinking they need to do. So I like to call these interactive read aloud. So you're reading aloud to kids, but you're stopping, just like you illustrated so wonderfully. You're stopping to say, gee, I wonder why the author said that. Let me go back and think about this character. Oh, I get it now. He said that because, or gee, I wonder why the author used that word. I know that word means this, but I'm not, all of those kinds of questioning. Or conversely, oh, I just read that, and especially this for informational text. Oh, I just read that sentence and I don't understand what it means. I better go back and reread it. Oh, I better look at the sentence before then and see if that helps me. All of those kinds of teacher modeling experiences are wonderful for students. And I also like what you said about reading aloud to all age kids. The best time that I ever had reading aloud to students was with a group of 8th grade dyslexic boys. Because they had struggled to read for so long. They were all quite bright, but they had never been able to read a novel that really captured their attention. And so I picked those novels. We read Hatchet. We read some books that boys would particularly like, and they loved it. We did it every day after lunch, and they couldn't wait. That was their favorite time of day, because I did those interactive read alouds with them, and they could respond. What were you thinking when you listened to me read this passage? What were you feeling when you saw what the boy had to do? How did that make you feel? So they were really tuned in, and we have to be tuned in when we read. So they got a lot of good practice, so that later on in the year, as they're reading, or 2 years later, as their reading got stronger and they could read those types of books, those comprehension strategies, the kinds of thinking that they needed to do were already in place for them. So it made that whole process much simpler, and it was a fun time.
Yeah, well, and also during this time, you can also help give them strategies for note taking, right?
Yes.
Because it's one thing to comprehend the text, but then to understand what the important things that you need to take from what you've understood to serve as a reminder for when you're reviewing.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially, I like what we've said about the characters in a novel. I think the note taking is really important for both, but especially for informational text, because you can get lost in information.
One thing that I often recommend to a lot of my clients, especially for ones that struggle, with written output, is looking into visual note taking. Or some of the software like Doodly, where they can do visual concepts, and it's easier for them to get that information out. Because if there's a better way that you can represent it as a picture that's more meaningful to you and gets more information, why not?
Absolutely. And you can add to your doodles as you're reading. Yes.
Exactly.